Good morning, everyone. So today we are going to talk about how to connect with multiple databases using Spring Boot. All right. Now, with a single database, we already developed several programs. If you want to communicate with one database, the task is very easy. You no need to do any additional configuration. You just need to add the data JPA starter and you need to configure this data source properties in the YML file or properties file. That is fine. But now today, my requirement is I want to connect with two different databases from my boot application. Two different databases means two different data sources will be available. In the application and properties file, I have configured two data source properties. One is for H2, another one is for MySQL. For H2 database dependency, MySQL database dependency added. Those data source properties are also added in the properties file. DB1 is nothing but it is belongs to H2 database. DB2 belongs to MySQL database. Auto DDL enabled. If the table is not available, table should be created. When your application wants to communicate with multiple databases, you need to maintain the entities into different packages. Can I keep all the entities in one package? You cannot. When you want to communicate with two databases, database 1 related table entities should be created in one package. Database 2 related tables should be created in one package. Suppose my application want to communicate with three databases. Then what I will do? I'm going to configure DB3 data source. For every database, one data source should be configured. DB3, if you have, for the DB3 entities, we need to create one more package. One more package for entities, one more package for the repositories. Are you guys clear as of now? DB1 entities, DB1 repositories, DB2 entities, DB2 repositories. When you have these data source properties and the databases differently, we need to tell to Spring Boot the package name is this for first database entities, and this is the package name for first database repositories. So one database can have multiple tables. Multiple tables, if you have multiple entities will be available, multiple repositories will be available. Now here I am taking only one table in the each database to show you the demo. If you want, you can take multiple tables also, then multiple entities will be available. All the entities belongs to first database should be created in one package and the second database entity should be created in the another package. Now clear, like this I have created my packages and I have differentiated the database related entities and repositories. How many data sources I have in my project? Two data sources I have in my project. So how Spring Boot will understand for which table it has to use which data source? Multiple data sources you are configuring, you need to tell to Spring Boot by writing the configuration logic like this. Spring.db1.data source. This is the first database related data source. If you have only one database, Spring Boot will create the data source for us. But when you are having multiple data sources, you need to create the data source object on your own by telling the data source name. So what is my data source name? Spring.db1.data source. So db1 is the name of the data source that I am configuring here. So when it comes to the configuration classes, what I am doing here in this YML, we are configuring db1 data source and db2 data source we are configuring. Got it? With this db1 data source properties, we are creating one data source object. Data source object. For the data source object, I am configuring this data source name. I'm giving this data source name to this db1. Why we are giving the data source name for the db1? With which database this data source should create? It should create with the db1 data source. I'm giving that. Now here I'm creating a data source object by using @bin. Once the data source object is created, then we need to create the entity manager. For entity manager, you need to tell where your entity classes are available. in.ashokit.db1.entities. My persistent unit is a db1. I'm taking the persistence unit name as a db1. Then once we create the entity manager object we are passing to transaction manager. So data source is created first. Using the data source we created entity manager. Using entity manager we have created transaction manager. These are the three beans we are creating: entity manager, and a transaction manager. Data source object is injected into entity manager. Entity manager object is injected to transaction manager. All this configuration we have done in the db1 config class related to first data source. Same thing when you go for the db2 config, in the db2 config also we'll create one data source. With the data source we'll create the entity manager. With that entity manager we'll create the transaction manager. Now look at this. First I'm taking db1 config class. It is I'm representing as a configuration class by using @configuration. Enable transaction management, enable JPA repositories. Where the JPA repositories are available for db1, I'm giving this base package name. So in this package can have multiple repositories also. If you have multiple tables in your database, then it can have multiple repositories. It can have multiple repositories. So here db1 data source I have created. With the db1 data source I'm creating entity manager factory. So in the entity manager factory, what I'm doing, I'm setting the properties. I'm creating a entity manager data source object properties. What are the properties I have created? Package of my entities and persistent unit I'm configuring. I'm creating a entity manager factory. Right. Now with this entity manager factory, then I'm creating a transaction manager. I'm creating a platform transaction manager. For the transaction manager, I'm injecting the entity manager factory. This is a constructor injection. So here JPA transaction manager object I'm creating. For that object I'm using a parameter as a constructor. Constructor parameter I'm passing as an entity manager factory object. First I'm creating data source. Data source is injected to entity manager. Entity manager is injected to transaction manager. DB1. See here db1.repositories, db1 data source name we are configuring here. db1 entities name we are configuring here. Now do you understand why I am maintaining separate packages for two DB related entities? We need to tell them that. Good. Similarly, let's go to db2 config class. So we are constructing a data source. With the data source name, we are constructing entity manager. For entity manager, I'm giving the entities package. And with that entity manager, we are creating transaction manager. I hope this is clear for you. Look at these diagrams, guys. So if you want to connect with more than one database, then for all the databases, we need to configure the data sources in the YML file or properties file. Then we need to create the DB configuration class for DB1 and for DB2. In the DB1, we'll configure the data source. With the data source, we'll create the entity manager. With the entity manager, we'll create the transaction manager. In this entity manager, I'm telling you, it should go to which repository, which entity. Which repositories are belongs to DB1, which repositories are belongs to DB2. The package names I already configured in the configuration classes. Very good. With this, we are ready. Let me go to demo REST controller, adding the data, getting the data, save all, stream of new users. I want to store users data by using this method. Okay, user repository dot. Now see here, I have created one demo REST controller. Book repository I have injected, user repository I have injected. Now guys, when I use user repository dot save all, user repository belongs to which database? User repository belongs to which database now? Can you tell me? Database 1 or database 2? How Spring Boot will understand that user repository belongs to database 1? I am directly injecting that and I'm creating the database. How the Spring Boot will understand user repository belongs to first database based on the db1 config class? Now here I'm injecting book repository. How it will understand that? How it will understand that book repository belongs to db2? Are we telling that information to Spring Boot? Book repository belongs to DB2, user repository belongs to DB1. How I am telling to the Spring Boot which repository belongs to which database? Based on the configuration. Based on the configuration class. What I have done in the configuration class? I have configured like this. Data source, entity manager, transaction manager. So now here I am having a method. Add data method is available. Add data method is used to add data URL pattern. Simply send a request. It is going to call user repository dot save all. It is going to call book repository dot save all. User repository data should be stored into H2 database. book repository data should be stored into MySQL database. When I send a get request to users, whatever the user data stored, I should be able to get it from H2. When I call books, I should get the data from MySQL database. Is this REST controller clear for everybody? Okay, with this, we are good with everything now. Right. Refresh this project. Run as boot application. Run as boot application. Now, check this. How the project is getting started. Yes. Now go to H2 and check it. Localhost means localhost 8080/h2-console. Right. Password. Click on connect. Am I able to connect to H2 database? Is my user table created in the H2 database? ID, email, username. So in the user data, in the H2 database, is it creating user table? Yes. Now let's go to MySQL, show tables. Oh, book table is created in the MySQL. It is working. Right. So in the H2, a table is created with a user table. In the MySQL, a table is created with a book table. Now, next, send a request to our application. Send a request to our application to load the data to the tables. I have created a just one dummy method to save the data to the table. /data is the method. Okay, let us clear the console. See the console, what will happen. Localhost colon 8080/data. Send it. Data added successfully. Okay, go and check the console. Queries are executed. Insert the records into user table. Insert the records into book table. Insert the records into user table. Insert the records into book table. Now go to the database. Run this query. User data stored in the user table in the H2 database. Now go to MySQL. Select star from. Are we able to see the books data in the book table? Are we able to get the books data in the book table? Yes. Users data is available in the user table. Book data is available in the book table. How Spring Boot understood that it has to store the data into H2 database. It has to store the data into MySQL database. How it understood that? User repository belongs to DB1, book repository belongs to DB2. Chalo, let's get the data 8080/users. 8080/users. Am I able to retrieve the users data? And let's write books. I'm able to get the books data also.